So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Keraraya, and we are more than honored to host today a very important book launch in the framework of our ASC seminar series, chaired by our director, Marlene Decker, Jan Abing, Rick, and myself. It's a great pleasure, as I already said, of course, beyond that, to host and to give the digital floor later on to Professor Isabel Hofmeier. I'm sure you all know her in the sense that any sort of praise from my side would be certainly not enough to cover all the great achievements that the scholar has brought to life until now. But still, I'll do my best to, summarize for you the best highlights in her career so far. Isabel Hofmeier is professor emeritus at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, of course, and distinguished global professor at New York University. Professor Hofmeier is by training, and this makes me even more than happy, a literary scholar, expert of African literature, post-colonial history of the book and print culture more broadly. And she has worked extensively, as all of those involved in Indian Ocean studies know, in Indian Ocean world and oceanic themes. Probably it's also worth mentioning indeed that she currently co-directs a project titled Oceanic Humanities for the Global South, with a beautiful, feel free to visit the website as well to get to know more about the project that certainly seems, groundbreaking already, and only because of the partners with whom she is co-working, like from Mozambique, India, Jamaica, and Barbados. Among her most eye-opener books, I must mention today South Africa and India, Shaping the Global South. I believe one of the earliest contribution that started shedding light truly on the Global South. Gandhi's printing press experiment with slow reading, my favorite, published by Harvard University in 2013, The Portable Banyan, a transnational history of the Pilgrim's Progress. And among her special issues, I'm pretty sure that we all know, have read and enjoyed the special issue on print cultures, nationalism, and publics of the Indian Ocean. And I also would like to mention very great co-edited books that she has bring to life, such as the one co-edited with Pamila Gupta, Eyes Across the Water, Navigating the Indian Ocean, or The Book in Africa. Now, in a conversation we had a while ago, during which I believe Karin Baba was also involved, and it's a great pleasure to see her with us today. Isabel informed us, about the new direction that her work had taken. And so in a way, today is a great opportunity, maybe for our first time or so, indeed, to hear about print culture connected with the environment, right? The environment in relation to climate change and the Anthropocene that we all know have become pressing issues, of course. So it's therefore a great pleasure, of course, to have Professor Isabel Hofmeier with us today and to launch her book for the first time, actually. And it's even a greater pleasure to have it in cooperation with closer and great colleagues from the Netherlands, Professor Margriet van der Wal, University of Amsterdam, and Harry Wells, African Studies Center Leiden, more precisely convener of the collaborative research group, Trans-Species Perspectives on African Studies. I think I expressed already how happy, glad, honored I am. So thank you all. Thank you, Professor Hofmeier, for being here today. Thank you, our discussants. I'll give the digital floor to Isabel now. and then we will open up the floor for useful, fruitful discussions as well. Thank you.
Firstly, my very warm thanks to Ana Chiara for the invitation to be here and for that very lovely introduction. Thanks also to Margriet and Harry for taking time to read the book and to comment, and to Rick for his assistance. Okay, so let me, I'll talk for about just sort of 20 minutes, and I'll begin with some background to the book. So the project really took shape some years back in the wake of my previous book, Gandhi's Printing Press Experiments in Slow Reading, which explored Gandhi's newspaper and printing endeavors during his South African sojourn, which was 1893 to 1914. So one minor theme in the book was Gandhi's steadfast opposition to copyright, which he regarded as a form of private property. So having completed the book, I wanted to investigate this thread further. Was Gandhi's position unusual or not? What was the situation with regard to colonial copyright? So rather surprisingly, this research led me to the Dockside and the Custom House, since, as I discovered, it was this department that had overseen copyright. So as you can imagine, printed matter coming from outside the colony had to be funneled through the port city, where customs officials checked to see that it was not pirated, seditious, or obscene. So customs hence became the part of the colonial state that oversaw both copyright and censorship, because they could then censor books that they deemed inappropriate. So I sought out the Customs Archive in South Africa with some trepidation, expecting dry and tedious reports on taxation and tariffs. Instead, I found a fascinating archive teeming with objects, in some cases actual ones like swatches of fabric, labels of tinned condensed milk, and packets of seeds. The documents themselves were filled with arguments about what these items actually were. Was a substance butter or margarine? Was there a difference between tea and medicinal herbs? Was a young pilchard the same as a sardine? The Custom House was far more intriguing than I had anticipated. Now, had I done this project 10 or 15 years ago, I would no doubt have written a drier book focusing only on the print culture implications of copyright and censorship in the Custom House without considering its coastal location. While Gandhi's printing press had situated itself in the field of Indian Ocean studies, like much scholarship on the maritime world, there was not much actual sea involved. Instead, the ocean featured as a backdrop for human movement at sea, more surface than volumetric depth. Over the last decade, rising sea levels and climate catastrophe have impacted powerfully on oceanic studies itself, which now grapples with how to go below the waterline and to engage with the materialities and ecologies of the marine world. Dockside reading is an attempt to embed print culture in this new oceanic studies, to put water and paper closer together. The book tracks printed matter from ship to shore and through the regulatory regimes of the Custom House. The setting is late 19th and early 20th century Southern Africa, with glimpses towards other parts of the British Empire. The study traces how customs dockside protocols shaped understandings of copyright and censorship. So rather than an institution associated with the rights of authors, copyright became conflated with cargo and commodity markings, especially a thing called mark of origin, like made in England or made in Australia. British copyright became a token that a book had been made in the metropole and was implicitly white and so safe to admit. Colonial copyright was hence construed as a logistical inscription and a racial trademark. As regards censorship, material was not read so much as treated like other forms of cargo, scanned for markings and sampled for traces of offensive material. Tax collectors at heart, customs officials were not keen readers. Instead, when dealing with a suspicious book, they applied the same techniques they did to other suspect cargo. They sampled, counted, measured, and touched. Rather than reading them, they assayed books as objects. So books were hence routinely judged by their covers, their language, or their script. French was generally suspect, non-Roman script positively dangerous. Inspectors focused on outward metadata like title, copyright, or publisher rather than content. Like other suspect cargo, objectionable books became potential vectors of contamination. The reading methods of the Custom House were to feed into subsequent apartheid censorship practices, which in part drew on the methods used by customs inspectors. Now, the literary consequences of the Custom House eddied outward, not only across the dockside, but at times onto and under the water. Customs inspectors dumped unclaimed, smuggled, or banned items into the ocean, as did passengers approaching those ports where pirated reprints of copyrighted works were not permitted, and the books were then thrown overboard. So this, the book is, as you see, the book title is, it has got these two terms, dockside reading and hydrocolonialism, and these constitute the larger framework for contextualizing these reading and hermeneutic protocols. So the first term, just very briefly, provides a micro view of the dockside procedures in relation to cargo and how these were transferred to books. The second term furnishes a larger framework for theorizing the type of shore-shaped literary formations. And let me then talk just briefly about dockside reading and then hydrocolonialism. So very briefly, dockside reading I discuss under 4 headings, which is objects, bodies, books, and reading. The section on objects argues that ports are shaped by the objects that pass through them. Cargo, for example, determines work routines, where people work, the architecture of the port. So liquid has to be gauged, tea has to be sniffed, heavy substances have to be examined on the dockside, more portable material in warehouses, and so on and so on. So the section then on bodies argues that these practices around objects were then transferred to bodies. So, for example, policies of fumigation, disinfection, and quarantine were first applied to objects and then to people. So on Ellis Island, immigrants were tagged, chalked, and marked as if they were cargo. Indentured Chinese laborers were routinely classified as bonded merchandise. The transfer of this carceral orientation onto human bodies is clearest, obviously, in the case of the Atlantic slave trade, where people were, of course, branded like wine barrels and crammed into holes. Across the Atlantic world, customs officials were intimately involved with receiving and processing enslaved people who were regarded as dutiable commodities. So now the section on books explores how customs officials classified and read books. Books were generally classified as a subspecies of paper, or in the words of the Indian tariff, books were regarded under paper and its applications. Books then came in with this, in a paper world of kind of, pro forma documents that were being imported, like receipt folios, membership certificates, letterheads, and labels. And where you do get books, they often resemble forms, account books, birthday books, Boy Scout registers, cricket score books, and so on. So when books were suspicious in some ways, officials then had to read them. Unsurprisingly, they treated publications as a form of miniature cargo, their outer coverings perused for logistical inscription, their inside subject to the same protocols of measuring, sampling, and counting deployed on other troublesome consignments. So as I've said, they tended to assay books rather than read them. So these modes of reading produce definitions of what the colonial book could or should be. One of these is the book as form. So in which you have a template from the metropolis, like the membership certificate or the letterhead, which was filled then with local scribblings, quite literally a case of form over content. So many colonial novels followed a similar pattern, with a generic blueprint from the imperial center boilerplated with provincial content. The book as form also featured in settler and immigrant handbooks, which included the forms to be completed on arrival. So this fusion of handbook and form helped to land immigrants, guiding them through disembarkation formalities. These volumes tended to act in concert with the port infrastructure and its land reclamation, which quite literally reached out to incoming passengers of the right class and race, giving them their first purchase on the colony. We might think of these settlers' handbook with form as a mode of textual land reclamation or landfill, extending literary infrastructures outward to enable the immigrant to become landed. And landed was an important term that had two meanings, physically to place on the dock, but also to be legally and permanently admitted, as in the phrase landed immigrant. So these genres of the dockside can, I argue, usefully be inserted into debates on Southern African literature. And I think we can see them as standing between two key colonial genres, the story of the shipwreck and the farm novel. So just as port cities were intended to overcome the problem of shipwreck and to offer safe landing to settlers of the right class and race, so the book as form assisted in this process, offering settlers traction on the colony itself. The institution through which many settlers achieved this aim was, of course, the farm. And as J.M. Coetzee has famously argued, the farm novel became a key intellectual instrument of land possession and dispossession. Just very briefly, the section on reading considers these customs reading practices in relation to current sort of post-humanist object-oriented ideas of the book and reading. So I compare customs reading to digital literary criticism, where reading by metadata and algorithm is routine. So customs officials also did not have reverence for the book as a humanist object that could change consciousness. It was simply more cargo, a kind of form of uncooperative stationery. So these methods of half reading then accord with a lot of current book history, if you follow it, where people are very interested in, not reading or non-reading or half reading or semi-reading, which is how most reading proceeds, because very few of us ever read a whole book. Just then to move on to hydrocolonialism, it's the term, it's a neologism. It riffs obviously off the term post-colonialism, and like that concept has a very wide potential remit, which could include, for example, colonization by way of water, various forms of maritime imperialism, colonization of water, occupation of land with water resources, declaration of territorial waters, militarization and geopoliticization of oceans. Could be a colony on or in water, rather like the ship is a miniature colony, or the penal island. Colonization through water, flooding of occupied land, colonization of the idea of water, establishing water as a kind of secular resource. So modeling itself on post-colonial theory with its cultural remit, hydrocolonialism traces the configuration of literary institutions across land and sea, empire and environment. It explores the literary implications opened up by overlaying the hydrological cycle onto imperial and post-imperial cartographies. And so that move then requires us to think laterally, vertically, and contrapuntally between different water worlds and hydro-imaginaries. There is, of course, now a very exciting range of literary and cultural studies approaches, critical ocean studies, wet ontologies, immersive methodologies, blue humanities, hydrocritical approaches, atmospheric and elemental approaches, and so on and so on. I situate my work as, as part of that movement and against that background. And I'm particularly interested in two themes, that is colonized water and creolized water. So just very briefly, the first explores how is water in fact itself colonized both above and below the waterline. So examine features, like submarine infrastructure and forms of colonial governance over water. As regards creolized water, this theme investigates pre-colonial understandings of water as inspirited, by different spiritual beings, and how these interact with colonial and other ideas about water. So that, in Southern Africa, if you look at any body of water, you're looking at a very interesting and complex space that is inhabited by a congregation of sort of metaphysical beings. And I think I'll leave it there. I've got a description of chapters, but I think you'll have enough to have a sense of what the book is about. So thank you.
Thank you. Exactly. Yes. That's very well deserved indeed. Thank you, Isabel. Lovely presentation. I think certainly now those who haven't yet read it will buy it very soon. And speaking about that, I'll also paste the link on how to order it later in the chat. For now, I'd like to start in a way the second part of today's book launch that is made of indeed a conversation between particularly Isabel, the author of the book we are all learning from, and Margriet van der Waal and Harry Wels. I'd like to, I think to leave it to the two of them, particularly I'd like Margriet to start. I know she has several questions for Isabel, likewise Harry. So please, let's. I'll give the floor to you, Margriet.
Thank you so much, Ana Chiara, and thank you very much also to you and to Rick and to the African Studies Center for having organized this event and for the opportunity to engage in a conversation with Isabel about this fantastic book. Thanks, Isabel, for having written it and for offering this very useful notion of hydrocoloniality and dockside reading as a prism through which to look anew and maybe for the first time also in many cases at a range of social cultural practices and texts, practices of identification, of politics of belonging, border work, and so forth. And also thanks for the humor in the book. There were moments that really had me laughing, such as you referenced the discussions about when is a fish a pilchard and when does it become a sardine, but also the discussion or the section where you described the copyright anxieties about the stem really had me chuckling. That was very funny. For me, as a cultural scholar with an interest in what we do with literature and other cultural texts, this object-oriented perspective that you utilize in the text is very rich and exciting. And I learned much about moments in the circulation of ideas and objects that one seldom consider when one just sort of tend to focus on the text itself, such as, for example, the relationship between custom officials and the censorship board, or the relationship between custom officials and immigration officials. But I will get back to that distinction in a second. The first question I would like to ask you, and we've decided to make this more a conversation with questions rather than a long sort of a reaction. So after my question, Harry will get the floor and then we'll continue like that. But my first question is related to a book by a Dutch author that was recently published met een drukpers de Oceaan over by Lisa Kuitert. I don't know, well, I'll just show it here. She's professor of the history of the book at the University of Amsterdam, and she discusses the development of printed matter and the printing of matter in Indonesia during the time when it was a Dutch colony. And in her book, she documents the fast-growing demand for printed matter in the colony, initially for bureaucratic purposes, but soon too for commercial and especially educational purposes. And this educational purpose also was very much tied to a Dutch sense of a moral obligation to help the people of Indonesia enter the era of modernity via the colonial system, as she describes it. So one of the intriguing findings that she presents is that almost like a horse of Troy, from this stomach of the horse, knowledge came, amusement, news, advertisements, all as a result of the scurrying across the ocean of the printing press, which led to matter being printed in Indonesia, but also the carrying across the ocean of printed matter to Indonesia. So in your book, however, on the other hand, you indicate that the interest in printed matter, books and magazines and other forms of writing remained rather low at the start of the 20th century. You write, the size and the shape of colonial Southern African printing and publishing industry was small and an uncertain undertaking. And you also mentioned that the number of items copyrighted in South Africa was quite small. And in fact, that there was a clear desire on the side of the white South African population to keep the local Black population at a low level of education. The idea of civilization, as you described it, being copyrighted to settlers. So the book market was limited and the distribution was difficult. And in fact, in chapter 3, you explain how British copyright imagined its subject to be a white man, and that the idea of copyright extended to native subjects didn't even occur to the Native Affairs Department itself. So this intrigued me, this difference in how printed matter functions and how the relationship between settlers and those who have been colonized by the settlers can be thought of by means of printed matter. In the Dutch case in Indonesia, it seems to have functioned differently, but in the South African case, than in the South African case. Do you have any ideas why or how one might explain this difference? Why there was such a strong sense of the superiority of white civilization and the desire to keep the Black population at this lower education level?
Okay, thank you. Those are such an interesting bundle of issues. I think just on the comparison of the Indonesian and the South African case, I think it's often book history people tend to follow books. And of course, books are a very, very small percentage of what gets printed. Mm. So, and of course, what the Customs House makes you realize is how, books are this tiny sort of epiphenomenon on this vast sea of sort of basically job printing. So I'd sort of be interested to see just in the Indonesian case, is it that this is a sort of one of these book history issues that you're only following the book rather than looking at a much broader sort of media ecology? So I think that, would be one sort of interesting question to follow up. In terms of the question then, I suppose, as you say, of how, I suppose, of questions then of settlers, education, African communities, how all of that plays out. It's obviously, highly varied. I think the question would be, the critical issue there is the factor of Christian missions and how they factored in. And then they would have had both their own in-house printing arrangements, as well as they would have been importing stuff from their parent mission society. And of course, there were very different philosophies of education. In some instances, it was this idea that you had to reproduce a very sort of elite form of education. So there were these kind of Ivy League mission schools, and then the other end was you had to have absolutely vocational training. So I think that's the sort of area where probably the issues that you're asking about really play out.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that kind of distinction makes a lot of sense. And as far as the focus of Kuitert's work is concerned, she does look at a broad range of texts, so not only at books. But what I found fascinating after I read it and then read your book and then returned to her work was the complete lack for the official house, the Customs House. It's sort of, so I thought, I'm very curious to see what kind of gatekeeping function did take place in Indonesia in that regard, because that's, I think there's one place where she mentions a reference to someone saying this magazine cannot enter because of its pornographic nature, but that's really the only reference. There's sort of censorship rules taking place within Indonesia, but not at that point where water and land comes together, which, this is really the sort of very interesting and intriguing location and site that you unpack in your book. Thanks, Harry. I'm giving the microphone to you.
I was muted by Rick, but I have to unmute myself. Okay, thank you very much, Margriet, and Isabel. Also, thank you very much for a very clear and concise presentation of your book. I echo very much Margriet's words. Thanks to the African Study Center for organizing this, and to have the privilege of such a prominent book to be launched first in the Netherlands. I mean, I will remember that one. So thank you very much, Isabel. Isabel, despite the fact that you mentioned in your presentation just now that you, and I think I quote, brought paper to water in a way that seas, oceans, and water are no longer just a backdrop, what's in the word I thought at that moment, but are taken serious in relations of hydrocolonialism. Still, my question is about that relation in terms of kind of equal attention to both, if not all sides of that hydrocolonial relation. So my question is about the kind of primary direction between hydrocolonialism in its relation to water. And I would like to introduce that question with an anecdote and a quote from a book that I recently read. Just like Margriet, that is a sheer coincidence that you read something before and I did as well. I will quote from that as well. The first is an anecdote. A couple of years ago, I got a tour in Koeberg nuclear power plant. And it was quite interesting, especially in the current day context, but to get that tour. And I remember that there was a question about safety and security, obviously. And the gentleman giving the tour told extensively what kind of protocols, procedures, and things were in place to be sure that in any kind of accident, ranging from accident to disaster, there were protocols of safety and security in place, and that they had widening circles around Koeberg that would be covered by those protocols. So with a minor incident, it was a range of 5K, and then there was a radius of 10K, and then there was a radius of even further. And I was intrigued by that because, as you know, the Koeberg power plant is exactly on the coast, with one side actually in the water and the other side on land. So I asked, okay, thank you very much, but what about the ocean side of things? What are the protocols there? And then he said, there are no protocols. And I said, well, thank you very much for your honest answer, but isn't that rather odd? And he said, no, that's not odd, because when anything happens from an accident to a disaster, the ocean will dilute it in ways that, you know, it will solve itself. That's the one anecdote. Then a quote is from a book that I recently read by Jay Griffiths, and it's entitled Wild, an Elemental Journey. And in her chapter on the element of water, that includes seas and oceans, she writes the following, and I would like to read that little quote. A funny thing happened on the way to the Americas. A funny thing happened on many voyages of discovery, and it is this. The sea was barely seen. The ship was of interest. Any sighting of land was noted, but the ocean was merely an absence. Not discovered, but ignored. Aqua nullius. When I look for the deeps in the so-called literature of the seas, all I find is navigation. When I yearn to read of oceanry, all I get is shippery, quadrants, and compasses. It persists, this strange absence. The Oxford Companion to Ships and the Sea, reprinted throughout the 1990s, has almost nothing about the sea in it. There are some 17.5 pages under the entry ship, but C merits no entry at all. Whale gets just 6 words, but there are full entries for whale catcher, whale factory ship, and whale boat, while whaler occupies half a page, and whaling gets 2.5 pages. Probably you feel it coming. The question is, if a relation has at least 2 sides to them that kind of deserve equal attention, what would your response be if I ask you if that is also true or would work for hydrocolonialism's relation to water?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That's also another fabulous bundle of issues. I think it is this very interesting question of how the sea comes to be seen as a kind of anti-environment, into which things can be dumped. And the view that I took very much from the Custom House was that there's a kind of binarized view of the ocean from these sorts of officials. So on the one hand, there's this massive romance of sort of naval manliness, all these heroic adventures at sea, and that's one sort of thing. And then on the other hand, you get this idea of the sea as the dumping ground. And so quite often, quite literally, that would happen. Customs officials, in the case of unclaimed goods or books that were deemed especially sort of horrendous, they would drive out they would sail out 3 or row out 3 nautical miles, which was the end of their territorial waters, and dump the stuff in. And that, of course, it's a long-standing thing. Under the Dutch at the Cape, if you were found to be guilty of sodomy, you could be, one of the forms of execution was drowning. I see also if you were convicted of bestiary, you and the beast were executed by being thrown over water. And then that becomes a major theme in Cologne in various kinds of authoritarian or colonial rules. So this thing of dumping murdered political prisoners at sea has, it happened under Pinochet. Happened under apartheid. Mainly people dumped murdered political prisoners into the Atlantic, but also some into the Indian. During decolonization, especially in the Caribbean, the departing British just dumped huge amounts of incriminating documents into the sea, partly because when they were leaving India and they tried to burn it, it burned for so many days that it attracted sort of international media attention. So I do think it is that it's sort of this, I suppose, partly this idea of aqua nullius is because, people, couldn't go underwater. People didn't know very much. So it was, the sense of people were really mainly interested in the surface. But I think they're interesting ways also to think about the sea as not being empty. In much Southern African waters, the sea is the home of the ancestors. So they are, in some senses, if you think about it, they're full along much of the sort of East African littoral. It's full of jinns, so I think it's kind of, it's always sort of both full and empty, depending on where you stand.
Thank you very much.
And I take the opportunity again. Thanks, Harry. Isabel, in the book, you offer an intriguing analysis and interpretation of Custom House practices that you call dockside reading. And you bring this kind of bureaucratic reading, algorithmic, discrete, and partial, in relation with another kind of reading that is continuous, intertextual, and possibly an analog or analogous, as you do in the case of the relay between custom officials, for example, and census. and which stubbornly keeps on presenting itself as something that requires attention, the wordy interiors of texts, as you call it on page 15. So the question that I have now, I think, is a question about relationships and continuity, or about relations and some things that are discrete. And perhaps also in a way, it links to this previous question in the sense that what escapes the gaze of the customs official and sort of manages to enter through the through the gaps in the net, the bureaucratic net or the legislative net that this customs official has tried to put down. I was wondering whether one can think of, this distinction, not only in terms of reading text, but also in how we understand institutions to work as units that nevertheless relate in specific constellations to one another. They're not just discrete of and from one another, but they're also relational to one another. Because the focus in this book is on the customs house, but in chapter 2, you also discuss the links with migration. You also discuss the links with the censorship board in chapter 4, and the competition that sort of arises in relation to the migration officials, between migration and customs, in terms of who is a landed migrant, who not, and so forth. Who is more important on the dock side. A similar set of tensions you describe between Customs House and the censorship board, in the sense that the censoring of texts was a complex project with different moments and ways of reading, which led to different, or that was sort of utilized together to pronounce whether a text was deemed offensive or not desirable. So I was wondering whether this object-oriented approach that you take and the relationship between bureaucratic reading that sees texts as a combination and a sort of a sum total of discrete units, and other types of reading that pays close attention to texts' inner content and sort of the relationality between text and other texts, it's also a kind of position taking on your part in relation to what is often pitted against each other as two opposites, a distant reading and close reading. So I'm very curious to hear you on this.
Oh, thank you. Thanks again. I think if I could just say, as I did this custom stuff, it's, I suppose it's like any large institution. The dockside came to remind me a lot of universities, with these like different departments, each one its own little fiefdom and fights between them, and who was the most important and who was going to get resources. So that was also an important part of the story, so customs would fight with the Harbour Masters Department, would fight with immigration and restriction, and so that was also just, quite interesting, because you tend to think of, these kind of distant readings of the colonial state as this sort of well-oiled machine. But, in fact, it's this rather sort of kind of creaky, conflict-ridden, fault line-driven set of operations. Just on part of your question also was about what slipped through, and I think that's an interesting thing, partly because the archive I looked at was very much from the Customs House. The book, some people often ask me about, well, what about forms of resistance? What about those sorts of things? And the book doesn't have a lot to say about them, but I think there are interesting questions there. A lot of sailors, for example, would sometimes smuggle through radical political pamphlets, because particularly, dock workers are often quite well organized and have these strong transnational networks. There was, interestingly, in Durban, kind of interesting exchange of secondhand clothing between Lascars and African dock workers. So that was also quite an interesting, sort of kind of under the radar operation. Just in terms of, and then I suppose the other part of the question really was also then about, I suppose, the censorship and the different, again, also the sort of arguments that happened. And I suppose it was, in some senses, I realize the thing that I really learned about censorship, I suppose there are three things. The one was, I realized, like, and I think I might have mentioned this, but most studies of censorship look at the very top end of the censorship machine. So they look at the high committees at the top, and they assume that the censors read everything. This is sort of to go much lower down the system. And I suspect that most censorship systems are like this. So the people right at the bottom, there's very sort of rudimentary reading that happens. You know, and so it's, yeah, it's, you know, the picture of censorship that emerges is quite different really from, you know, if you look at the very, very, very high end. I think the other thing I really learned was and this is, I suppose, a sort of particularly Southern African thing, and it's a sort of byproduct of the South African War, the Anglo-Boer War, and that is the influence of military censorship on these customs guys. So they use that military opportunity to reinforce and strengthen their own hand. So that, I think, becomes a really interesting thing. And then the other thing is I suppose, you know, the very early stages of the Cold War, where it's really this sort of kind of growing anti-communism, which means then that the Department of the Interior insists on taking over these operations, which Customs, of course, is quite upset about because it's a loss of sort of kind of authority for them. But it is then this very interesting thing of thinking about South African censorship also in this longer story of militarization and then sort of anti-communism in the Cold War. So yeah, so I hope that sort of answers at least some of the issues you raised.
Thank you. Yes, it certainly did. But I'm still intrigued whether you want to say something about how distant reading and compartmentalized reading and sort of close reading is often pitted against each other, but you show also how they work in collaboration with one another.
Okay, yeah, I suppose it is, I mean, I suppose the Customs, actually, now that I think it was a very particular kind of close reading. So it's probably not that distance. You know that thing, if you're teaching a large class and then you say, look at page 45 and let's discuss this paragraph. You know, so you're taking that paragraph as a small instantiation of the whole book, which is, now that I think about it, actually really what they would say, look at this paragraph, it's highly objectionable, it stands in for the whole book. And sometimes they were different, and then sometimes you would, in fact, they would do a particular kind of close reading. But I think that also in some senses, I think that they were also, there was a distant reading going on, because I think the really interesting form of reading about Customs is that they're reading the edition, which is a sort of reading that literary academics never really think about. We think about reading one book, but they were thinking, okay, here's a whole consignment of books. If you ban it, you're banning the whole edition. So you're sort of reading 3,000 books all at the same time. You know, so it's sort of like a bizarre form of both close and distant reading.
Yeah, exactly. It's you're putting the juxtaposition and the opposition between the two a little bit. You problematize that opposition by showing how the one contains elements of the other. Yeah, it's so fascinating. Thanks a lot.
I don't know if I'm expected to ask another question. Anna,
if you have a very short question, why not?
Yeah, just a short question, because then others can join in,
yes.
which is probably much better. There's Isabel. There's one other question that kind of ask you to maybe elaborate a bit more what you kind of tell us on page 3, where you mention that this book is interesting for our post-humanist and Anthropocene age. And as you may have gathered from my first question, I am a bit overtaken by an animal turn and all that transspecies stuff. So forgive me for that, but it has to do with post-humanist thinking. It has to do with the Anthropocene, with the worries that go with it, and all that. Could you elaborate a little bit more, maybe also for the other listeners, what makes this book interesting for our post-humanist and Anthropocene age?
Okay, thank you. If I can just have a little detour, just because I know you're interested very much in multi-species stuff. And in fact, I really was very, very keen to try and do some multi-species stuff in this book. And very early versions, I try to think about ports, cities, and the, you know, what does that mean for the sort of marine life and species? There are all these new surfaces, you know, the bottoms of ships, these vertical quays, wharves, you know, what does that mean? It aids some species like the Navy shipworm, you know, the teredo, which moves around the world in wooden ships. It obviously makes, you know, the sort of bottom benthic communities are badly affected by dredging and so forth and so on. And I sort of tried to think about that. I also thought of bringing in the whaling station, because most Southern African colonial ports had whaling stations. And it was, you know, to think about the whaling station also then as one of these other departments, you know, like this on the dockside that was fighting with everybody else for resources. But anyway, I sort of ran out of time and didn't put the whaling station in. So that's a bit of a kind of a detour. But I think I think it is for the post-humanist thing, the book, it demonstrates a kind of reading where it's a kind of post-humanist understanding of the book. So the book is always seen as the classic humanist object, which will speak to each individual consciousness, you know, and change and improve the person to become, you know, the fully human, proper subject. And partly this is, so it's trying to sort of use this to say, a lot of, you know, we might think, we look at these customs guys and we think, what a, you know, they must be so stupid, look at what they're doing. But actually, a lot of the way that they read is in fact the way that we read. So I use this example. There was a quote from Nadine Gordimer, who says, and this was in the 1970s, and she writes to the censorship board objecting to some, you know, yet further power that they are giving themselves. And she says, you behave, the censorship board, something to the effect of treats literature as though it is a bar of soap. And of course you can understand she's writing from the depth of apartheid, and it's a sort of, and she had herself, you know, was aware of the history of customs as the first censors. And of course what she's doing there, she's pitting the sort of, this classic kind of binary that people try and set up is between censorship on the one hand and literature on the other. So the one is the sort of terrible oppressive power on the state, and the other is the sort of apparently, you know, liberating form of the liberal imagination. And of course, so I was interested then and said, well, you know, they are reading things as a bar of soap, and and increasingly, as I try and make the argument that, you know, digital forms of literary criticism read like a bar of soap. You know, they are very much driven by algorithms. You know, the literary text is not for the critic; it's directed at the algorithm. You know, so all of that. So to say, you know. And I think a lot of book history is interested, as I was saying earlier, in sort of debunking this humanist idea of the book. So it's simply adding to I think what is really quite a lot of stuff on thinking about the book as a post-humanist rather than a humanist object.